My name is Stillwaters, and these are my stories. I am an experiencer of the phenomenon, an empath, a lucid dreamer, and a high consciousness traveler of other dimensions and alternate timelines that make up our universe. Over the past several years, I have awakened to a state of consciousness that has allowed me to glimpse into my simultaneous lives occurring in this universe. Like pages of a notepad, these alternate timelines are contained and exist simultaneously as one. And like the ink from a felt-tipped pen, my higher consciousness bleeds into these timelines night after night to experience these alternate timelines of my life. I do not pretend to know the purpose of these high consciousness experiences, only that they happen to me every night in full detail, and have decided to start writing them down and sharing them. Step into my world of awakening and enlightenment that I call the Chronicles of Still Waters. The following high consciousness experience you are about to enjoy is called Shining Lights in Dark Corners. Last night I awakened in the dream state, standing on the deck of a battleship. As I stood on the deck, I looked up towards the bridge and immediately determined that I was aboard a United States Navy destroyer. It was the middle of the night, and we were in the process of docking the ship in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. The night sky was clear, and the full moon was bright and made it easy for me to see all the commotion going on the ship. I quickly assessed by my business suit attire, and being a spectator to the crew, scrambling around me to secure the ship, that I was aboard this Navy destroyer in another capacity. The fact that I was even allowed to be on the deck at this crucial moment of docking the ship led me to believe that I must have been granted a high level of security clearance. For a civilian to even be allowed to move about so freely on board, one might think I was pushing the envelope with the liberties I was granted aboard this Navy destroyer, and that being held on a short leash did not apply to me, but I knew my place in all the organized chaos. I respected the crew doing their duties to be afforded such freedom by the captain. I was itching to get off this ship as soon as possible. I had enough of being confined to my cabin for as long as we had been out at sea. If the suitcase by my feet wasn't enough of a hint that I wanted off the ship in a hurry, clenching my credentials in the pocket of my trench coat certainly was. The air was cool and damp, and it being the middle of the night in late autumn didn't help much with that. I was tired, not having had much sleep and being awakened so early to be prepared to disembark from the ship, but I was considered a valuable asset and needed to be debriefed as soon as we made it back to dry land to complete my mission. The knowledge I possessed needed to be delivered and processed at a secured, sensitive, compartmented information facility, SCIF, for the Department of Defense, DoD. As I became more familiar with this timeline, I knew this wasn't my first rodeo. I had participated in several military operations as well as many classified missions along the east coast of North America with the U.S. Navy. My routine was always the same. I'd be assigned to an operation and briefed on their mission in Washington, D.C. before heading out to the naval fleet already on course to the theater of operations. I was then flown out to an aircraft carrier to rendezvous with the fleet just prior to the commencement of their exercises, like a piece of cargo, and then taken by helicopter to the Navy destroyer I was assigned to. As much as I hated being flown out to the fleet, it was done to secure the asset, that being me, and minimizing my known presence to the phenomenon that the Navy was trying to interact with at sea. It did cut down on my time at sea, because once I was out there, I was there for the duration, and the trip back to dry land was always the longest ride home. Officially, I was under contract to observe and assess these classified military exercises for the DoD, working for the Special Activities Division of the Central Intelligence Agency in a covert capacity, attempting to detect and analyze the military's engagement with unidentified anomalous phenomenon and unidentified submerged objects along the east coast of North America. I classified them all as the phenomenon because they were all from the same source And yes, the Bermuda Triangle is, and always has been, a target-rich environment for the phenomenon. Even with all the latest and greatest state-of-the-art tracking sensors and radar systems on board the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, nothing could shine the lights in dark corners like the unit I was involved with could. I always got a kick out of the academic community that scoffed at experiencers and their anecdotal evidence, while the CIA fully embraced us for what all the science and technology in the world couldn't give them: real-time data analysis with the phenomenon and a human compass as to where to point their multi-million-dollar equipment at when it made its presence known. For decades, the CIA was pushing the envelope at intelligence-gathering techniques by experimenting in pseudoscience, including such things as remote viewing. Their sole directive from the Department of Defense was to acquire actionable intelligence information by any means at their disposal, no matter how unconventional it may seem. Nothing was considered off the table for the CIA when it came to gathering intelligence. If the intelligence was accurate and provided some sort of tactical advantage for the DoD, that kept their funding rolling in for them to operate their clandestine projects. If you're wondering how a person like me became an ultra-top secret intelligence advisor for the Department of Defense, having never served in the military and, well, not even being an American citizen, the simplest explanation would be that it's complicated. I didn't get into these circumstances intentionally, nor did I even have any motivation for getting involved with the phenomenon. As a matter of fact, how I was introduced to the phenomenon was very innocent, like when a child becomes aware that you can see them and that child smiles and waves at you to acknowledge their awareness of your presence. You could say, the phenomenon acknowledged my awareness of their presence, smiled, and waved back. I was awakened to the phenomenon well before I got involved with the CIA, but due to the stigma around the paranormal, I kept a low profile with family and friends to avoid being considered crazy or called a nut job, and the negative consequences it would have on my life and career if I came out with the knowledge I possessed. Instead, I lurked in the shadows of the paranormal community with multiple anonymous accounts to hide my identity, to allow myself to engage with other experiencers who did not fear the consequences of being open about their involvement with the phenomenon. Throughout my life, I've experienced strange events that I would simply shrug off as odd, but not worth worrying about. Over the years, I would grow more sensitive to the world around me, but also to a world that many people are completely oblivious to. At first, I thought I was just very sensitive, as I would very easily pick up on other people's emotions. As I grew older, this ability developed and was enhanced to a level of clairsentience that garnered the attention of the United States intelligence community. I was in Washington, D.C. for a conference for my job, and the President of the United States was scheduled to be speaking to the delegates on the final day of the event. Security was very tight that day at what many of the locals informally called the Hinckley Hilton. It was given this nickname as it was the hotel where John Hinckley attempted to assassinate President Ronald Reagan in 1981. There was a very thorough security process to gain access into the conference hall that day due to the President of the United States' scheduled appearance, and once we entered, we were not allowed to exit until the conclusion of the speech being made. You could leave the hall at any time, but you would not be allowed to return once you had gone through the security process, and that frustrated a lot of delegates as we waited what felt like an eternity for the President to arrive. The scheduled time for his speech came and went. The Secret Service detail on site stood around the perimeter of this massive conference hall. I could feel that something was going on by their posture and movements in the hall, but no one knew what was going on, except for the Secret Service. I kept looking at my watch and knew the deadline for our delegation to leave the hotel to catch our flight home was getting closer. Our table had been given the honor, being the delegation from Canada, to be seated at the front of the hall for the entire conference. It was right in front of the podium where the President would be giving his speech. Due to our proximity to the podium and the deadline for us to leave, I knew the optics of our entire table getting up in the middle of the speech might disturb the closing ceremonies of the conference, as well as alarm the Secret Service agents by our sudden departure. People would most certainly wonder if we had been offended by something that the president had said in his speech, to all get up and walk out of the conference, and the Secret Service would be triggered by our sudden movement during the speech to take evasive action. Trying to be proactive about the matter and to give the Secret Service the heads up of our impending departure, I decided to get up and inform a Secret Service agent that we would be able to stay until a certain time, but then would have to leave the conference to catch our flight. I told the agent, regardless of how long the Vice President's speech ran, that we'd be out of there exactly at 1400 hours, and didn't want it to seem fishy when we all got up to leave. For some reason, I knew the delay was due to the president was not coming, and that the vice president was now being picked up to speak at the conference, and thought nothing of the consequences of saying that. The delays were in securing the new motorcade en route to escort the vice president to the venue from his location, as he was not in the same part of the city as the president. The agent that I spoke with communicated my comments verbatim to their security team. Through her radio device, received a confirmation in her earpiece, and simply nodded to me and said, "That would be fine." I never like it when a person uses the word "fine" as a response, and today would be one of those days to reinforce that as being not fine at all. As I walked back to my seat, I saw more Secret Service agents quickly enter the hall and appeared to be watching me return to my seat. I first assumed they were getting a visual of where we were sitting in the hall in case the speech went past our deadline, but I sensed that wasn't the case. As I took my seat, I felt an unsettling feeling washing over me and, in an attempt to calm my nerves, I sarcastically said under my breath, "Everything is going to be just fine." No one else knew at that time that the vice president was on his way to the venue for the president, or why. The president had suddenly become ill after his lunch, and he was currently indisposed because it was doing a number to his stomach. No one except the Secret Service was aware of this situation and the last-minute change, and the fact that I used the phrase "fishy" only added an exclamation point to the entire situation. At that moment in time, all they knew was the president became violently ill after eating some fish for lunch, and had yet to determine if it was a simple case of food poisoning or something much more nefarious. I knew exactly what the Secret Service was thinking. How the hell did this guy know about the fish, or was it just purely a coincidence? Was this guy mocking us by the emphasis he put on the word fishy when he said it? And how did he already know about the change in the itinerary, as he has been locked down with all the other delegates in the conference hall all this time? A few minutes later, an announcement was made at the conference that the president was unable to attend due to a pressing matter at the White House. We were informed that the vice president would be arriving soon to address the conference in the president's absence, and that our patience in the delay of the closing ceremonies for the conference was greatly appreciated. The vice president finally arrived and was able to complete his speech in time for us to get to the airport. Everything went without a hitch until I arrived at the airport. I was stopped and taken out of the line at the boarding gate to our flight for questioning. I had no clue what this was about at the time, and my colleagues teased me that it was due to my choice of traveling attire, had set off some sort of alarm with airport security. We all laughed about it, but I never boarded the flight, and it departed without me. I was detained by airport security until I was taken from the airport to the Pentagon for interrogation. What I thought was going to take a few hours ended up becoming a few days, courtesy of the United States government. Trying to explain how I knew specific details of the president's illness put me in a difficult situation where I had no way of providing a reasonable explanation other than saying I just knew it. My only saving grace, I'd have to say, was when the medical reports came back as only a minor case of food poisoning from the fish the president ate for lunch, and that he made a full recovery. I could tell this not by anyone telling me, but simply by the intensity of the interrogation from the first day had been dialed back, and they became more interested in how I knew the vice president was coming, even before the announcement was made at the conference. Had the president's condition been worse, things may have gone a different way for me. As the interrogation continued, my response of "I just knew it" failed to gain any traction in getting me back home. Out of desperation and frustration, I started to use my abilities to provide details on my interrogators themselves as proof of how I could know things that I shouldn't. I told one interrogator that his wife was expecting a child and that they would be having a little girl in the coming months, and even gave him the name she would be given. I told another interrogator that the coffee he provided me was too hot because the heating element on the coffee maker in the break room that he got it from was overheating due to a short in the electrical wall outlet, and that soon it would result in a fire if it was not unplugged and repaired. Whatever I brought up as an example of how I knew things that I shouldn't, they would quickly refute them as some sort of parlor trick, and that I was simply making these things up to avoid telling them the truth. The agent's wife was indeed pregnant, and he assumed I must have seen the screen on his smartphone that had a photo of the two of them with her belly bump. Stating the gender was a 50-50 chance, and guessing the name of the baby was just a shot in the dark based on his name, on his identification clipped onto his front suit pocket. He vehemently argued that I saw the photo when he put his smartphone down on the table during a previous interrogation session, and demonstrated this by placing his phone on the table before me to prove his point. I indicated to him that he and everyone who had come into this room had never once taken out their smartphones. I then slowly pointed to the one-way mirror across the room and said that the people on the other side could also confirm that to be true. In the heat of the moment, I smiled arrogantly from his action of showing me the photo on his smartphone by looking down at it, resting on the table, and thanking him for providing validation of my ability. The look of disbelief on his face was priceless as he slowly turned his head away from the one-way mirror that I was pointing at and quickly grabbed his smartphone and stormed out of the interrogation room. As for the coffee, the agent just thought I made that up because I noticed he too burned his tongue when he took a sip of his coffee while interrogating me. It wasn't until the third day when the interrogation suddenly stopped, abruptly. As you might have guessed, that heating element in the break room did indeed catch fire and triggered a fire alarm. The fire was quickly put out, and a fault was found in the electrical wall outlet. That was when everything changed. I was moved to a new location within the Pentagon. Gone was the sterile environment of a tiny interrogation room, and I was now sitting at a boardroom table in a large office. I was given anything I wanted to drink, along with a buffet of donuts and muffins that were brought in for the meeting I was about to have. What had started as an interrogation had completely changed by their line of questioning into what felt more like a job interview. Across the table from me sat an older officer in military uniform that appeared to be of high rank from the amount of hardware on his coat. Another man present wore a black suit and had the appearance of what people best describe as the men in black. And a third person that was present didn't fit the mold of either of the two men present in the room. He also wore a suit, but did not give off the same vibe as the man in the black suit. He remained relatively quiet and only communicated to the man in black by writing notes down on a pad of paper and sliding it over to him to read as they continued to question me. At one point of the interview, the man in black read a message on the notepad and then slid it over to the military officer to read. When he did this, the meeting was abruptly halted, and the officer left the room along with the man writing down notes. The conversation that unfolded next involved only me and the man in black. He informed me that he worked for the CIA's Special Activities Division and that my detainment was over and that I was free to go, but wanted to extend his deepest apologies for any inconveniences detaining me had caused. He said, due to the late hour of the day, that I would be put up at one of the nicest hotels for the night and would be picked up by limousine first thing in the morning and flown first class back home, courtesy of the United States government. He also went on to say that he would be providing me with a letter to give to my employer regarding my extended stay in Washington, D.C., and that they would cover my loss in wages as well as any inconveniences for the time that I was away. With this matter considered closed, the CIA agent explained what had happened and why Homeland Security went to such great lengths to interrogate me due to my comments at the conference with the Secret Service. As they take threats to national security very seriously, the actions taken to detain me were merely done out of an abundance of caution, as it was regarding the president's unforeseen illness happening right around the same time and my proximity to that situation. He went on to say that I possessed a unique gift, and one I should not use so frivolously in the future to avoid a repeat of what I had just gone through this week. He went on to say that if I was interested in exploring the possibility of putting my talents into service in a meaningful way for the CIA, that they would be very interested in providing me with that opportunity to do so if I ever wanted to scratch that itch. The CIA agent smiled and shook my hand and said that the intelligence community is always looking for a few good men. Exhausted from the lack of sleep and the stress of being interrogated, I was stunned by his offer of employment. I didn't know if he was being serious about offering me a job or if this was just another one of the CIA's tests in their interrogation process. I cautiously smiled back at him and gave him a slight head nod as I politely shook his hand. I didn't know how to respond to what he just said, so I remained silent and just kept smiling as we made our way out of the boardroom. Waiting outside the boardroom was a security officer that was assigned to escort me out of the building to a car waiting to bring me to the hotel. That night, after a nice steak dinner in the hotel lounge, I was relaxing in my room, having taken advantage of the minibar in the suite watching TV, when there was a knock at the door. To my surprise, it was the high-ranking officer from the meeting at the Pentagon, standing there asking if he could speak to me for a moment. I was worried this ordeal wasn't over, but he took me by surprise when the colonel began telling me a story of an incident that happened to him and his crew out at sea. I didn't really know where he was going with all this until he bluntly came out and told me that the man writing notes in the meeting today was part of a unit of very unique intelligence-gathering individuals, and his purpose that day at the meeting was to give me the smell test. He was present to see if I had the right stuff to join their intelligence unit to assist the colonel and his crew with the activity happening in the Atlantic Ocean. I asked the colonel if that guy was interviewing me for a position in his team, how come he didn't ask me any questions himself? The colonel quickly responded, because he didn't have to. He was able to know who you are, just like what you did at the conference and during your interrogation this week. At that moment, the colonel's phone went off, and he had received a text message. He quickly read the message and said he had to leave. As he was walking out of the hotel suite, he placed a business card on the desk in the room and said if I wanted to expand my horizons in a way very few have ever been given the opportunity to do, all I had to do was pick up the phone and call him, and he'd make it happen. Considering this was the second invitation given to me that day to explore the possibility of putting my abilities into service, I took this offer much more seriously when the colonel went out of his way to visit me at the hotel and left his business card. From my chair across the room, I could see the gold-embossed logo of the Navy SEAL protrude well above the surface of the business card as I sipped my drink. I knew right then and there that having me spend one more night in this luxurious hotel suite was intentionally for me to have this conversation with the colonel. They could have easily put me on any flight leaving that evening, but instead, they chose to let me fill my belly, kick my feet up and have a few drinks, and once I was in a state of relaxation, make their true intentions known. The next morning, the limousine was waiting for me at the hotel. Sitting in the car on the way to the airport, I pulled out the business card the colonel gave me. As I held it, I let the gold-embossed Navy SEAL logo protruding over the surface of the card glide over my thumb, and I could sense the colonel was a good man, a man of honor. What I didn't expect to feel was a curiosity from his last words to me in the hotel room that felt more like a desperate itch needing to be scratched, like the CIA agent had said to me. What did he really mean about expanding my horizons? When I arrived at the airport, rather than being dropped off at the front doors of the terminal, the limousine drove through a security gate and right onto the runway towards a hangar. When we arrived, there was a private jet waiting for me inside the hangar. Boy, they weren't kidding when they said I'd be flying first class. The limo driver grabbed my suitcase and carried it for me to the jet plane. When I got to the stairway of the private jet, the man that the colonel told me was at the meeting to check me out greeted me with a big smile and extended his hand out towards me. I cautiously extended mine and shook his hand, and he welcomed me on board. Apparently, he was coming for the ride. I knew this was too good to be true. Uncle Sam may have some deep pockets, but there seems to always be strings attached to what's in them. During the flight home, he told me what was on that horizon the colonel was talking about, and convinced me to become part of an experimental secret intelligence gathering unit created by the CIA's Special Activities Division, referred to as PAL. The United States intelligence community sure did love giving things an acronym for everything. PAL stood for Passive Analysis Liaison, a little less flashy than the Men in Black, but it had 3 letters in it and was direct and to the point, and clearly defined our role in intelligence gathering. We were considered a military asset and not identifiable as an officer or agency. We would be assigned to a specific branch of the military from the CIA, much like a piece of top-secret military hardware would get loaned out for a special operation, and assigned a senior officer to report directly to as our handler. As you might have guessed, my handler was the colonel for the US Marine Corps, the officer that was at my interview and met me at the hotel. When the colonel needed my expertise, he'd make the call to activate my services, and within 24 hours, I'd be on site anywhere in the world and at their full disposal. This totally disrupted my ability to maintain employment with my current employer, so I ended up quitting my job and became an author. I made myself a fiction writer and would use this new career to conceal the new line of work that paid me very generously. To make a long story short, that is how I got involved with working with the most secretive intelligence unit within the United States government. Hidden in plain sight, the PAL unit blended in the government world just as another government employee would. About the only time we stuck out was when working with the military side of things. On those occasions, such as being on site of a military operation, we were required to wear a suit and tie, and if anyone questioned our presence, they were quickly told that we were a private consultant, working with them in troubleshooting the equipment being used for the mission, which wasn't far from the truth. We were provided top-level clearance credentials and the cover story of working as a private consultant for the DoD. We were literally the ghosts of the intelligence community, able to go where they needed us to be, and were assigned a high-level officer as our handler, our get-out-of-jail card, if things went sideways for us. All we had to do is get them to make a call, and the hammer would fall so damn hard on anyone that questioned our presence that they would never bring it up again for fear of losing their rank and their career. Having the ability to see what some call beyond the veil gives you insight into an undiscovered universe that resides just beyond many people's imagination, that space between spaces. And that is where I began to engage with the phenomenon. My life would reside in 2 different worlds forever. Once you have experienced it, you are permanently changed by it. There was no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. By day, I would have to deal with my mundane waking life of living in a world with people void of any thought of other dimensions. I would be reminded many times throughout my day of its presence by a stream of constant synchronicities, getting a glimpse of shadow people, feeling changes in vibrational energy within and around me. At night, however, these experiences would get much more intense when I would cross that threshold of consciousness that only a few people have been awakened to. Who was I to try and convince anyone of the phenomenon and the existence of many worlds, all happening simultaneously and the experiences I was having were real. To coin the phrase, those who know, would best describe when you met another person who had experienced this awakening to the phenomenon. That is what happened when I was at the Pentagon and was given the nod to join the PAL unit. The man that had been brought in was there not only to get an impression of me, but also to confirm if I was awakened to the phenomenon, and more importantly, if I was willing to engage with it. Back to the deck of the Navy destroyer, a sailor gave me a nod that the gangway was now secured, and that was my cue to disembark. When I reached the bottom of the stairway, 2 master-at-arms officers were waiting for me to drive me to my debriefing. They reviewed my credentials and opened the rear door to the black SUV they rolled up in. I was never sure where I was being brought and didn't really care. The SUV had blacked-out windows, which made it impossible to look out of at night. It was late, and their priority was simply to get me from point A to point B. As soon as I was in the SUV, I was more focused on sorting the intelligence in my head for my report. I was allowed to have a small notepad to jot down keywords or numbers to help me organize my thoughts, but I was not allowed to put in writing more information in the notepad than that. Once I arrived at the skiff, that notepad would be turned over after my debriefing and would be destroyed to leave no trace of my activities. I would be handed another identical notepad to replace the one I just surrendered, and the assignment would be complete. As we drove to the skiff location, it began to rain. The driver turned on the windshield wipers, and shortly after they began chattering on the windshield. As I stared at the wiper blade moving back and forth across the windshield, the repetitive sound reminded me of being back on the bridge of the Navy destroyer I was just on before we engaged with the phenomenon. I was standing in my designated spot on the bridge. I could hear the radio chatter from the other ships at sea during the exercise, as well as the communications going back and forth with the crew. Every once in a while, we'd hear a report from the aircraft flying around the fleet. I was there merely to take in the operation to try and get a feel for any unusual disturbances in the skies or below the water. We knew we were in the designated area where UAP activity was occurring. The entire point of these exercises was to try and flush out the UAP, to try and observe these tic-tac vehicles and neutralize one. I could feel just from the sound of their voices that the Navy pilots were amped up to follow their orders for the exercise. Who wouldn't be? Flying a multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art fighter jet with extreme prejudice across the skies. With a bird's-eye view of the fleet and the skies clearing, the sun began to rise off the horizon. They were the fastest thing in the skies that morning, at least for the moment. It was then that radar started picking up something to the north of us at a very high altitude heading towards the fleet. Almost immediately, the radar operator and the captain looked over at me to see my reaction. I knew it was a UAP entering the theater of operations and gave a direct stare towards the captain with a solid nod of my head and started making my way off the bridge. I was given strict instruction that I could only confirm or deny the UAP activity on the bridge, and any further communication I provided had to be done in a secured location. Immediately, the captain barked out orders to the crew, and a call sign was radioed to the fleet and pilots that we now had a new target to intercept. I headed down to the onboard skiff, where the more sensitive and highly classified data-gathering equipment was located. I had my credentials scanned at its entrance. I signed in and was permitted to enter. Once in, the door locked behind me and I would remain in there until it was declared this exercise was over. Inside the skiff, I had a desk and chair where I was able to pull out my notepad and pen and start reading the room by observing the ongoing interception of the UAP and listening to the pilot's comms. The skiff had a discrete channel to the pilot's navigation systems and allowed us one-way communication to pilots to provide discrete navigational support to assist them. When they communicated to the pilots, it sounded like one of the plane's standard warning alarms, but the flight crews knew that it was direct and uninterrupted comms to them from the skiff. I would remain silent for the most part, but if I did have something specific to point out to assist in the exercise in relation to navigation, The skiff was the only location that I was allowed to speak on the ship to the intelligence team. Any communications that needed to be sent to the captain would be called in on his direct phone line on the bridge. For all the other intelligence data that I would pick up, that was for me to mentally record and jot down keywords to remember certain details or anything else that I would experience. The parameters for my job were just too woo for the military or intelligence to be made aware of it. As they say, loose lips sink ships. Well, that's not too far from the truth. This UAP had entered the area from a high altitude, not specifically from outer space, as most people think these UFOs come from. It began accelerating on its descent towards the fleet. When the pilots made visual contact, it passed between the two fighter jets, and one of the pilots made the comment that the object was falling from the sky from his observation. I knew from its quickening speed that the UAP had sped up to evade their interception and was on a course into the ocean. I refuted the fighter pilot's observation and instructed the team in the skiff to prepare to track the UAP beneath the surface of the water. In under a minute, the UAP had reached the surface of the ocean near the fleet and splashed down into the water like it was going through a cloud. There was no change in the object's velocity going from the air into the ocean. The entry point location into the water was identified, and the coordinates were sent to the entire fleet for the next attempt at interception. The UAP's transition from air to water had not affected its rate of descent, but once it was underwater, it quickly disappeared from the Navy's tracking systems. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. It was as if it had become one with the water. There was absolutely no trace of it. The fighter pilots doubled back to fly a perimeter around the last known location of the UAP, awaiting their next orders. The team in the skiff was scrambling to focus their attention on the sonar data being relayed to them from the submarines in the fleet, when I sensed another UAP coming towards us, just above sea level from the south. I shouted out that we had another UAP coming from the south, flying nap of the earth. A call was made immediately to the captain to give him the heads up, while the message was fired off to the fighter pilots. The pilots hit their afterburners and headed south of the fleet to intercept. As they were able to lock in on the incoming UAP coming from the south, the first UAP emerged from beneath the ocean. It was like a giant game of cat and mouse. The chatter on the radio was almost hard to keep track of what was happening, but as the situation evolved, I felt it was evident by the movement of the UAPs that they were merely a distraction for something else that was about to happen. All I could do was make a mental note of what I was feeling as the exercise continued. On the port side of the fleet, where the first UAP came out of the water, the ocean began to bubble like a hot tub. Over the radio, I heard them say it might be a release of methane gas coming from the ocean floor, but as they started to distance the fleet from this anomaly, an enormous craft slowly rose out of the water. It was at this point that the team in the skiff fired up their dark project data recording systems in the room and triggered their camera recording equipment on all the ships to remotely start capturing this object slowly rising out of the water. Unlike previous exercises that only involved chasing smaller UAPs, this enormous craft had never been seen before. An all-hands alert went over the radio comms for the entire fleet to change course towards this enormous craft as it rose completely out of the ocean. It was now apparent to me from the activities of the first two Tic Tac UAP that they were scouting craft, most likely AI-controlled to monitor the environment and provide navigational data to this enormous craft to ensure it did not collide with anything, and more importantly, it was not interfered with as it prepared to leave the area. Unlike the two UAPs that looked like big white Tic Tacs, this UFO had defined features on it and was metallic-looking. It reflected the ocean below it and the sky above it, almost making it appear to be invisible if it was not for all the water falling off it as it rose high in the sky. It was the size of a football field and ascended silently into the sky. By now, the fighter pilots had exhausted their fuel supplies, and a new team of fighters were on their way to take over the pursuit. And even more fighter jets were being ordered to launch once the massive UFO was detected. Unfortunately, by the time the new fighter jets had arrived, the large UFO was well above the surface of the water, and like a blink of an eye was gone. It had completely vanished off radar, as if it never existed, and the two UAPs encircled the fleet for a moment longer, before they too also blinked out of existence. The dark project data recording systems in the skiff remained operational for a few more minutes until an all-clear was announced, and the fleet resumed their planned exercises for the remainder of the operation. I continued to make mental notes and write keywords in my notepad. The intelligence team were riding high from the intense engagement and had seemed to have picked up an encrypted signal from the larger craft and were feverishly trying to regain composure to ensure they did not compromise the data they had just recorded. It was probably going to take them weeks, if not months, to decrypt the signal that they were able to record. For me, not so much. I too had picked up on the encrypted message. However, for me it was not encrypted. It was not a message. It was a place, a location, and its transmission concluded with the words, "Go, no go." As the excitement in the skiff and over the radio was settling down, I was calmly writing down the numbers I had felt being projected to us from this massive UFO. As a way of hiding their sequence, I quickly tried to jot down these coordinates as the numbers to the pages on my notepad so as not to allow them to be known in case my notepad got into the wrong hands. It was a bit of a cover your butt policy of mine, but it was effective. Fast forward to my debrief going on in the skiff in Norfolk. The CIA agents watched me slowly decipher the numbers, back in order, into what appeared to be GPS coordinates. Digit by digit, their eyes were glued to the piece of paper I wrote them down on. As I slowly revealed the coordinates, one of the agents excitedly started shouting out the rough location in North America, where it was directing us to. When I was given these coordinates, it was like they were trying to warn us of something going on there. What go, no go at the end of the transmission meant I did not know. Another agent was inputting them into a mapping device that I had never seen before. It looked like a military-grade laptop with a big NORAD decal on it. When the agent hit enter, the computer bleeped and without any hesitation exclaimed, "Holy shit!" What I didn't know then, but would eventually learn about later, was the coordinates that I had received were the exact location of one of the nuclear missile launch facilities located in the Midwest. I would also learn later that immediately following my debriefing, that a nuclear emergency search team was deployed to that nuclear missile launch facility as a precaution to secure the site and put it into lockdown. Upon further inspection of the site for any breaches, it was detected that there was a fault with the missile's guidance system. Had it gone undetected, it would have resulted in a catastrophic launch of the missile during their routine test scenarios. A computer board on the missile's go-no-go abort shutdown system, normally used during a launch test to end the test sequence and return the missile to standby mode, had failed. Its circuitry failsafe was stuck in the go command position instead of the no-go position that was its default by design to prevent a misfiring of the missile. Had the missile combat crew gone through another launch test sequence, they would not have been able to have had a successful shutdown of the nuclear missile. The missile would have launched, and a broken arrow would have had to have been declared. It comes as no surprise to anyone that the history of UFOs being spotted over nuclear missile launch facilities, or even shutting their electronic systems down, has been happening for many years. What makes this case unique is that this was the first time in the history of intelligence gathering that a communication was received from the phenomenon that led to prevention of a broken arrow. A broken arrow, for those not familiar with the term, is defined as an unexpected event involving nuclear weapons that result in the accidental launching firing, detonating, theft, or loss of the weapon. This significance would lead to much speculation throughout the intelligence community as to what decrypting systems were used in getting this message deciphered so quickly. The only reason why I was even told this information was because the information that I was able to provide them prevented a really bad day for the entire world from happening, and they wanted to show their appreciation by letting me know the impact the PAL unit was making. Not being an officer, I could not be awarded any form of commendation or promotion for my services, and being involved in a Black Ops project, there would not be a letter from the President thanking me for my work. All I'd be getting is a firm handshake and a pat on the back for shining lights in dark corners. This concludes my high consciousness experience of shining lights in dark corners. This broadcast and the content is copyrighted, all rights reserved. No part of this media publication may be reproduced, distributed, or transmitted in any form or by any means, including electronic or mechanical methods, without the prior written consent of the copyright owner. This publication is a work of fiction. Names, characters, organizations, places, events, and incidents are either used in a fictitious manner or are fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, actual organizations, or actual events is purely coincidental. For rights and permissions, please contact the author.